Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to those of you who braved the weather. I don't know, I haven't been out since 8 o'clock. Is it still drizzly? Oh, well, cloudy. Well, it's great that you're all here. And thanks also to those of you who are tuning in on Zoom, which reminds me that I will ask you all to silence all of your devices and cell phones and anything that makes a noise so that we can give our Zoom audiences the full benefit of our attention without interruption. Well, it is a great pleasure to welcome back my friend Jeffrey Rosen for an important discussion about his important new book. Its title, of course, is derived from the founding documents, by which I mean, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day column. Now that's an inside Roosevelt House joke, of course, but in doing some online inquiry the other day, and fortunately, My Day, not always brilliantly written, but faithfully produced every day, no matter where its author was traveling, is fully digitized. And I was surprised at how many times Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned that phrase, the pursuit of happiness. In 1936, for example, she wrote about our forefathers' commitment to the pursuit of happiness, and she expressed that sentiment to support the new old age pension bill, Social Security, which of course was birthed right here in Roosevelt House, as you've heard me say many times. Eleanor mentioned the need for government support of better public health, unemployment insurance, equal access to education and the arts, all, she said, part of the umbrella of the pursuit of happiness. She wrote, "The attainment of life and liberty required most of our energy in the past, so the pursuit of happiness and the consideration of the lives of human beings remained in the background." 5 years later, she even cheered John D. Rockefeller when he endorsed the ideal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A few days after D-Day, she hammered on the theme again, predicting that many of the things which were said in the original Declaration, I think the youth of today will reaffirm, and it would be hard to improve on the unalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what the youth of today is carrying out. God grant their elders help them. One more, just after Franklin's death, even as she was thanking the public for their messages of condolence, she remembered this of her husband, the president. His chief interest was in seeing that the average human being was given a fairer chance for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what made him always interested in the problems of any group which was at a disadvantage. As I said, not great writing, but interesting sentiments. So, did Eleanor and Franklin get it right? For that matter, did the founders get it right? Were they explicit enough or precisely as vague as they wanted to be? For those answers and for a 21st century evaluation of that hallowed promise and its true meaning, we indeed have the perfect guest. Jeffrey Rosen has served since 2013 as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, which he has transformed into not only a shrine to the founding document, but as an incubator for education and civic engagement for scholars and the public alike. It's also great fun to take children and grandchildren to, for sure. And I've done 2 generations of visits, so I can attest to it. It won't surprise any of you here from the neighborhood this evening that this brilliant fellow is a product of the neighborhood too. He grew up on the Upper East Side. He was the valedictorian of the Dalton School, graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, and then got his law degree at Yale. Formerly the legal affairs editor, except for going to Hunter, it's the perfect education, right? Formerly the legal affairs editor of the New Republic. His previous books include those on the U.S. Supreme Court and biographies of two of its legendary figures, William Howard Taft and Louis Brandeis. Between or amidst books, Jeff is also a professor of law at George Washington University Law School and a frequent on-air commentator for MSNBC and CNN, where he interprets the Constitution and the law. As I said, this is his second appearance here. He brought his last book to Roosevelt House right before the pandemic lockdown, as fate would have it. He was one of our last speakers before we locked down. And it's the story of his marvelous chance encounter and subsequent friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. A friendship based not on the law, but on, can you guess? Do you know? Opera, right? The best-selling book was RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on life, love, liberty, and law. So, to cite that subtitle, he's already spoken here on life and liberty. Now we welcome him to Eleanor and Franklin's house to discuss the third promise in that foundational trinity, the pursuit of happiness. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Rosen.
So wonderful to be back at Roosevelt House. I had such a marvelous visit to talk with you about Justice Ginsburg, and I'm so excited to talk to you about how a reading project to understand what the founders meant by the pursuit of happiness changed my life. It changed my conception of how to be a good person and also how to be a good citizen. And it's made me into a crusader for the radically empowering act of deep reading that I want to tell you about. It was wonderful that Harold went back to the primary sources and to my day to give us examples of how Eleanor Roosevelt used the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And you heard that she was characterizing what FDR stood for, and it was an equal opportunity for all people to use their talents to the best of their abilities. It was not the pursuit of pleasure or immediate gratification, but what the ancients and the founders would have called the pursuit of virtue or self-mastery or self-improvement or character improvement so that we can cultivate our talents and be our best selves and serve others. And it was very much still current in the 30s and 40s when Eleanor Roosevelt was writing. It was the core understanding of happiness at the time of the founding. It dated back to the ancients, and it persisted all the way until, I think, around the 1960s, when all of a sudden happiness became you do you, the me decade, feel your own bliss. And the idea of happiness as immediate gratification was embraced in a way that's literally the opposite of the understanding of the best pursuit of happiness throughout our history. So let me tell you about the completely unexpected and unusual reading project that led to this book, and then I'll tell you what I learned. So it was during COVID, and I was reading about Ben Franklin's project to achieve moral perfection. Some of you may remember from his autobiography that in his 20s, he set out to achieve moral perfection. And the way to do that, he figured, was to make a list of virtues that he should cultivate and try to practice them every day so that he can improve them. And his lists he derived from his classical reading, and they include virtues like temperance, prudence, industry, resolution, cleanliness. He saved the ones he found hardest for last, chastity. He had just fathered a kid out of wedlock and struggled with that. And then a Quaker friend read his list and told him to add one he'd forgotten, and that was humility. Imagining the book, Humility by Benjamin Franklin. So he decided, inspired by the great moral philosopher Pythagoras, about whom more later, that daily self-accounting is important for the improvement of virtue. He put the virtues on the left axis of a grid. He put the days of the week on the right axis. And every week he chose to focus on a different virtue. And each night he would see whether or not he'd fallen short of the virtue in question, like temperance, if he lost his temper and he thought he could improve. So he tried this for a while, but he found so many X marks every night because he kept losing his temper and falling short of the virtues that he gave it up after a bit, but he felt he was better for having tried, that the project was worthwhile. What I noted, I'd known about this project because improbably a few years ago, my rabbi in Washington, D.C. recommended that a friend and I try a Hebrew version of Franklin's Virtue Project. We didn't know that Benjamin Franklin came up with it because it's called Musar, or character improvement. And it turns out that in 1808, a Hasidic rabbi, Mendel Leffen, who admired Franklin, translated his 13 virtues into Hebrew and offered them up to Hebrew self-improvers. And it's practiced today without attribution to Franklin. So this friend and I tried this for a while, and we'd pick a different virtue every week and make the X marks every night. Like Franklin, we found it's incredibly depressing. and I was kind of going through a hard time then and was having trouble keeping my temper and equanimity and resolution, and just there were so many X marks that we also gave it up, but found it was a worthwhile project. So during COVID, I was revisiting Franklin and noticed that he'd chosen as a motto for his project a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And it said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." Okay, that was interesting, but I didn't make much of it. Then, in the way of synchronicities and coincidences, a few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the UVA campus. And on the wall of the Boar's Head was a list of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson wrote for his daughters to practice for daily living. And I hadn't seen Jefferson's list before, and amazingly, they're almost identical to Franklin's. Industry, silence, if angry, count to 10, if very angry, count to 100, was Jefferson's advice. Resolution, another of Franklin's virtues, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. They're almost the same virtues, classically infused. But then what really got my attention was I learned that when Jefferson was old and kids who were going to law school or seeking advice would write to him, "What's the secret of happiness?" he chose the same book by Cicero, the Tusculan Disputations. And he had a passage that he would hand out that said, "He who has tranquility of soul, who is neither exalted by undue exaltation or despondent by undue depression, he is the tranquil man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man." So, wow, I thought I've got to read this Cicero book because it was so important to Franklin and Jefferson as a core understanding of virtue and tranquility of soul being the core to the pursuit of happiness. But what else to read? And then I came across this magic reading list that Jefferson would share with young people who wrote to him later in life and asked, "How should I achieve an education?" And this reading list, which Jefferson revised over the years, was very arduous and inspiring in its length and breadth, and also in Jefferson prescribing the hours of the day that you should read the different books. He said you should wake up every morning before sunrise. And in the morning, both before and after sunrise and breakfast, read moral philosophy and political philosophy. Then in the early afternoon and before lunch, you're allowed some history. After lunch, some government and science and astronomy. After dinner, some Shakespeare and elevating poetry, and then to bed. And this is 7 days a week, and this is what he did when he was studying for William and Mary, and it was what he thought every educated young man should do when he was seeking an education. And what drew my eye was the section that Jefferson alternatively called Ethics or Natural Religion. And at the top of this section was that Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations. And then there were other books of Greek and Roman moral philosophy. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, and then some Enlightenment works, both John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Bolingbroke, David Hume. I had to read these books. I felt it was a gap in my education. And I've had the most marvelous education. As you heard, I've been privileged to study at these wonderful universities with wonderful teachers who I continue to give thanks for every day of my life for having inspired me on a path of reading and learning. I studied literature and history and political philosophy and law with all of these wonderful teachers, but I just missed these works of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 1980s. And I remember in the 80s yearning for this kind of guidance, this kind of, you know what I'm talking about, for moral guidance. I was studying in college, as it happens, the Puritans, with a wonderful teacher, the great scholar of the Puritans, Sack van Berkovich. And I was unconvinced by the rigors of Puritan theology. The Puritans hold that to achieve salvation, you have to be randomly predestined for heaven at birth. And it doesn't matter what you do in life, your good works and even your faith won't save you unless you are blessed by God's randomly granted grace. This is a bit of a bummer. It's not exactly an incentive to be a good person in life. So to overcome this, the Puritans came up with all sort of completely unconvincing theological hair splitting, like salvation precedes rather than follows good works, and therefore good works might be reassuring evidence that you'd already been predestined for heaven, but they couldn't guarantee it. So this wasn't doing it for me. Plus, I'm Jewish. and the idea that salvation by faith alone was not something that was accessible to me at that moment in my life. So I was craving an answer to the question, could salvation or could a purpose-driven life be achieved by reason and reflection rather than by blind faith or randomly granted grace? And what I didn't realize, because these works had fallen out of the curriculum, is this is exactly the question that the classical moral philosophers had set out to answer. So then, here's what I did during COVID. It was COVID. We had all had some more time on our hands. I was inspired by Jefferson's schedule, and I got up every morning before sunrise. I started reading from Jefferson's reading list and from the classical moral philosophy. I'd watch the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I'd learned. And I understand that this practice seems very weird. And I had not expected to be writing sonnets about Greek moral philosophy before COVID started. I had started writing some poetry before COVID. My beautiful and brilliant wife, Lauren, is here, and she is a poet, and she inspired me to try writing poetry. And then a friend of mine, Barry Edelstein, who runs the Globe Shakespeare Theater, had just written a YouTube video of how to write a Shakespeare sonnet. And he gave the formal structure. The meter is easy, but it's supposed to have a volta or a turn in the third stanza, and that kind of inspired me. And I guess, anyway, I wrote a whole bunch of sonnets summing up the wisdom. What I later learned is that lots of people in the founding era who read this great literature wrote sonnets and poems about virtue, summing up, including the great black poet Phyllis Wheatley, who I talk about in the book, Alexander Hamilton, Mercy Otis Warren, the brilliant satirist of the Revolution, and John Quincy Adams would wake up in the White House, read Cicero in the original, watch the sunrise, write excellent sonnets, and take a walk along the Potomac. So there's something about this beautiful wisdom that craves to be encapsulated and distilled in some poetic form. Anyway, I spent a year waking up, watching the sunrise, which is, after all, the most beautiful experience one can have. There's nothing more beautiful than a sunrise, and it was so wonderful to have this practice and ritual. And I read all of this great works, and what I learned changed my life, and it changed my understanding of the founders, and it changed my understanding of how to be a good person. And what the founders believed was that happiness requires virtue and not seeking pleasure. But what's so significant is they had a particular understanding of virtue, which is not intuitive. These words are not self-defining. Aristotle defines happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. What do excellence and virtue mean? They got their notion of virtue from a distinction introduced by Pythagoras between reason and passion. Pythagoras, in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system of triads and fifths, if that weren't enough, Dayenu, he also was a prophet and guru who lived on the Isle of Crotona and encouraged his disciples to first be good and then like a god. And the way that you could live like a god was by self-mastery, self-discipline, self-perfection. His motto, which the founders often quoted, was reverence thyself. You can do that by rigorous moderation and eating and drinking. He was a vegetarian. His Ovid's book 10 on Pythagoras' vegetarianism is still inspiring. But the core was to use your powers of reason, which Pythagoras located in the head, to moderate or tame your unreasonable passions or emotions located in the heart. And Plato then added the faculty of desire in the stomach and said in his metaphor of the charioteer that the faculties of reason are the charioteer and should be used to align the noble and appetitive horses, so the soul is pulling in the same direction. And this idea that by using our reason to control our first impulses, our anger, our jealousy, our fear, we can deliberate and reach the calm tranquility and moderation that allows us to serve our long best interests. So it's really a version of the marshmallow test. Remember from Stanford, the kids were given one marshmallow if they demanded it right away. If they could wait for 15 minutes, they'd get two. Sober second thoughts, impulse control, reflection so that you can serve not your immediate ego-based urges, but your long-term interests, were the essence of Pythagorean and Greek classical moral psychology. And it's really important to recognize that this discipline, which was called faculty psychology, is what all the founders learned. And James Madison got it at Princeton from President Witherspoon, and Adams got it from reading the originals. But the 18th century version, channeling Plato and Pythagoras, talks about our faculties or powers, reason in the head, passion in the heart, desire in the stomach, and this idea of life being an ongoing quest for self-mastery and character improvement. The idea that it's not only our right, but our responsibility to improve our character so that we can be our best self and serve others. And that's why the Eleanor Roosevelt quotations still capture that idea that the pursuit of happiness is not an opportunity just to get what you can as fast as you please and gratify your immediate urges, but to contribute to society, to align yourself with the divine harmonies of the universe so that we can use our God-given gifts to be our best self and to serve others. It was very exciting for me in the course of this project to see how the founders recognized the deep connections between the Eastern and Western wisdom traditions. And there's an amazing moment when Thomas Jefferson and Adams are old and they're trading letters. And remember, they were friends for the Revolution, and they are fall out in the first and most contested partisan election in US history. And then they reconcile, and with Abigail's intervention. And what do they want to talk about? The connection between the wisdom traditions of the East and the West. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras is said to have traveled among the Eastern divines and read the Hindu Vedas. But Adams isn't sure that a translation of the Bhagavad Gita has actually been completed. And when he learns that the translator has lived to complete it, he's so excited. Jefferson says, I have it, I'll send it to you. I have a copy. And Adams is so glad that he'll be able to prove his intuition that Pythagoras got from the Vedas the basic wisdom of the Eastern scripture, which is expressed in a phrase that Gandhi loved to quote, renounce and enjoy. We've got to, once we renounce our attachment to external reactions and events and the thoughts and emotions of others, we can enjoy everlasting freedom and connection to the divine. And that wisdom, which is also expressed in the Dhammapada, we are what we think, life is shaped by the mind. Adams located in what he summed up as the essence of his mature spirituality, which he attributed to the ancient hymn of Cleanthe, and he expressed it in a sentence, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. It's this beautiful, synthetic, ecumenical spirituality that Adams got from his deep reading. And Jefferson responds, and he says he's been reflecting deeply on this. He's found the greatest pleasures of his life and his reading in the classics. He'd started out by turning to Cicero for the definition of happiness from the Tusculan Disputations, which, by the way, is a book on grief. It's very significant that Cicero wrote the Tusculan Disputations to console himself over the death of his own daughter, Tullia, and Jefferson encountered it at the age of 14 when his dad, Peter Jefferson, died, and both were finding in Cicero's counsel of emotional self-mastery some fortitude against the overpowering grief that the loss of their loved ones had caused. But after a life of reflection, Jefferson has thought about it, and he announces dramatically, at this point in my life, I am an Epicurean. Now, Jefferson stressed he wanted to defend Epicurus from the libels of the Stoics, who claimed that that meant he was a pleasure seeker. We think of Epicureanism as trying to seek immediate pleasure, but that wasn't what Epicurus counseled. Epicurus counseled the rational contraction of desires so that we can meet them. In other words, not craving after wealth or luxury or external goods, all of which can be taken away from us, but training our desires to seek that which we can actually attain, which is self-mastery. So the difference between the Stoics is that we should overcome desire entirely, which Jefferson found at this point of his life unrealistic, but that by rationally contracting our desires, we can achieve the calm tranquility that defines happiness. Isn't it just a remarkable symmetry that the youthful Jefferson and the elder Jefferson are both finding consolation in this idea of emotional self-mastery? And it's just beautiful that both men are, when they're old, they want to talk not about politics or about what they call their petty egoisms, but about their questing and their learning, and they're still open to new insights until the end. And that's the definition of the pursuit of happiness. It's being a lifelong learner. It's having the humility to be open to new ideas, to recognize how little you know, and realizing that our tranquility and self-mastery comes in openness to learning and growing into the ideas of others. In the book, I set out to explore how many of the founders applied this wisdom in their own lives. And it's a wonderful window into their minds, into their psychology, an effort to travel into their minds. And what is so striking is how constantly they talked about their efforts to achieve self-mastery, how candid they were about their own anxieties and their inabilities to overcome them, how inadequate they frequently felt, how they chastised themselves for not achieving enough, and how morally serious they were about trying to lead a good life. There are so many examples, and if I had to pick a single founder who best lived the ideals, it would be John Quincy Adams. John Quincy, John's son, gets this wisdom first from his mom and dad. John is reading Cicero and exhorting him to master his passions. Abigail, who John Quincy felt nagged by, actually, was constantly like, master your unreasonable passions, you know. And he's in Paris and he's looking at girls for the first time, and temptation is lurking on every street. You must use your time well, be not indolent and stuff. And he's kind of, you know, give me a break, Mom. He's sort of pushing her aside. But then he becomes the Boylston Professor of Oratory at Harvard, and he studies this stuff, and he writes an essay on the passions, which Adams offers to Jefferson as a peace offering when they're first making up. The effect of all this extraordinary learning, as well as his deep reading of the Bible, which he read every day and came up with creative primary text readings of, was to create in him an overwhelming sense of inadequacy, that he wasn't doing enough. And anyone who's ever had either a Jewish mother can sympathize with the cost of having a Puritan mother, because it was really took its toll on Adams. And there's this great letter where he's writing, I think he's 27 or something, he's the minister to St. Petersburg, and he's just been unanimously confirmed to the Supreme Court and turned down the appointment because he thinks he can be more useful in St. Petersburg. And he writes in his diary, I'm 27 years old and I haven't accomplished anything with my life. I'm spending too much time at the theater, I'm wasting time, I'm growing fat, I'm drinking too much, and I'm not mastering my passions. I must be more industrious. I will resolve to stop forming fruitless resolutions. He resolves to stop forming the resolutions, and he keeps resolving, but he actually meets them. And it's both daunting, but also humanizing for any of us who've ever wondered if we're just making a muck of things and aren't using our opportunities well enough to realize that even the greatest of our scholars and founders felt the same thing. Quincy Adams is so surprisingly relatable for all of his formidable, austere remove, both because of the human uh, uses to which he put this learning and to the personal cost he experienced. So he he writes these letters to his son, George Washington Adams, and he worries that he's burdened the kid with too big a name. Who could live up to such a name? Plus, Adams writes these letters from a Christian father to his son, where based on his readings of the Bible and the classics, he's exhorting his son to be perfect, even as our Lord is perfect, as Jesus exhorted according to Matthew and Mark. And the exhortation to be perfect is too much for George Washington Adams. He starts drinking, he spirals, and he jumps off a steamship and kills himself. And Adams has also just lost the presidency, and then his son kills himself, and he's overwhelmed with despair, and he just is praying for consolation. He wonders how can he even, go on. So what does he do? He reads Cicero. He just goes back and reads Cicero in the original, and is so inspired by his rereading of the Tusculan Disputations that he chooses as his motto a passage from Cicero, from the Tusculan Disputations. I plant my seeds for the benefit of future generations. The idea is we don't expect that our efforts will bear fruit in this lifetime, but by slowly planting seeds, we hope that they'll bear fruit later on. This is now, as it happens, it's the motto of Adams House at Harvard, because it was Quincy's motto, and it comes from Cicero. It's just mind-blowing, all these synchronicities, and it goes back to Jefferson. But then, here's the reason he's so inspiring. He then goes on to reinvent himself as the greatest abolitionist of his age. He wasn't an anti-slavery opponent when he started off, but based on his readings of the Bible, he's convinced that Jesus promises freedom and promises to free all the captives, and Adams views that as a prophecy of Jesus's condemnation of the immorality of slavery. And then he is elected to the House, the first president who goes on to serve in the House. He becomes an opponent of the gag rule, which forbids the introduction of abolitionist petitions onto the floor of Congress. He denounces slavery as a wicked inconsistency and violation of the promise of equality in the Declaration of Independence. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He's so inspiring that Frederick Douglass pays tribute to him as the greatest freedom fighter of his age. And then he casts a vote against the war in Mexico, and he collapses on the floor of the House. He's carried to a sofa, and his dying words are overheard, "I am composed." And he gets that from Cicero, whose model of happiness is the perfectly self-composed man who achieves the tranquility of soul that is necessary for everlasting virtue. Just overwhelmingly self-mastered end as well, and a beautiful end to a virtuous life. So that's John Quincy, and just what an amazing inspiration he is. Now, his abolitionism raises the crucial question: what about slavery? How is it possible that these men, who claim to be devoting their lives to the pursuit of virtue, could justify the fact that several of them were enslavers? What was striking for me to learn is that they didn't even try. That the enslavers from Virginia all recognized slavery as a violation of the natural rights promised by the Declaration of Independence. And in moments of self-awareness, some acknowledged their own hypocrisy. There is a striking quotation from Patrick Henry where he says, "Is it not amazing that I, who believe that slavery violates natural rights, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I will not attempt to. It is simple avarice. I cannot do with the inconvenience of living without them." Avarice, greed, exactly, that's what it is. They liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. They didn't think it was right. They didn't try to justify it. They just they couldn't bring themselves to give up the lifestyle. And putting it in terms of avarice, which after all is the Latin word for greed and is one of the sins, that the virtue is industry and frugality, and avarice and indolence are sins, but they just couldn't be bothered because they liked the lifestyle. And Jefferson, too, in his moments of candor, recognized that it was avarice that led him and other enslavers not to give up the lifestyle. He was always accusing other enslavers like South Carolina and Georgia, which didn't want to give up the international slave trade until later because they didn't need to import more human beings, unlike Virginia, which had enough. He called the South Carolina and Virginians avaricious and understood on some level that his own avarice and his addiction to the luxury that made his fantasy lifestyle at Monticello, this imagined Roman idyll of reflection and elevation possible, was slavery. Jefferson comes off worse on close examination when you read how morally self-conscious he was because of the degree of his own hypocrisy and the depths of his racism. I have a chapter on Phyllis Wheatley, the great black poet, who comes to America in chains and is given a classical education. And her master and mistress allow her to read the classics along with their kids. And reading Cicero and Seneca and all these great thinkers inspire her to write poems of virtue that make her the most celebrated poet of her age. And she sends her poems of virtue, which talk about the need for virtuous self-mastery, and also in her later poems call for the end of slavery, sends them to George Washington, who acknowledges her poetical genius. And then there's this amazing moment where her poems are so good that some people say she couldn't have written them. So the city of Boston holds a trial of Phyllis Wheatley. And it's presided over by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration of Independence in big letters and includes Cotton Mather and all the dudes who are like the major guys in Boston. And Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines that they asked her questions like, who is Apollo? Or, name the nine muses. And there wasn't actually a physical exam, but she somehow satisfied them that she wrote her own poems. And they solemnly, we attest that Phyllis Wheatley has written her own poems. So they're published, and they become an international sensation. And she becomes what Professor Gates called the Oprah Winfrey of her day. And she does this amazing victory tour of London where she meets the Duke, and she's given the keys to the tower and very much acknowledged as an international celebrity, all because of her classically infused poems of virtue. But there's a dissenting voice, and that is Thomas Jefferson. And it's just amazing. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, he actually has a chapter addressing Phyllis Wheatley. And he says, unlike Roman slaves who were white, they could be great and write great philosophy. Epictetus, the Roman moral philosopher, was formerly enslaved. But black people can't be good poets because black people are intellectually inferior. He basically just says it in the Notes on the State of Virginia. He says, I venture this as a suspicion only. I mean, he'd like to be proved wrong. But then he says Wheatley's poems are beneath contempt. They're not well written, basically because she's black. I mean, it's just appalling that this extraordinary, this devotee of reason and cultivation of the mind was so blinded by his own racism. In addition to that, of course, there's the more familiar story with the fact that he went to Paris. He started his affair with the 16-year-old Sally Hemings. She agrees to come back to the U.S., which she doesn't have to because she could have been freed based on Lord Mansfield's decision in the Somerset case if she'd gone to England based on her status in free territory. She comes back only if Jefferson promises to free their kids. And he does. And on his deathbed, he frees two of their kids. The other two he's allowed to run away. And their relatives, but no one else. And all of the rest of his enslaved population is sold to pay his debts. And this man who exhorts industry and frugality doesn't want to pass his debts to his kids. In fact, his entire constitutional philosophy is based on the immorality of any generation binding another with its debts. And that's why he insists that every law should expire after 19 years and there should be a new constitutional convention every 19 years. And Hamilton's entire proposal to fund the debt is immoral and unconstitutional because you can't pass your debts along because the earth belongs in usufruct to the living. And yet he so lives beyond his means that when he dies, Monticello has to be sold to pay his debts. Parents are separated from kids, enslaved families are broken up, and he never freed another soul in his life. So it's not a encouraging story in terms of Jefferson's own deep hypocrisy and racism. However, it is striking that the classical philosophy provided a moral framework for all of the enslavers and the non-enslaving founders, and some did better in living up to their ideals, as John Quincy Adams and others show. If there is one virtue that most of them practice consistently until the end of their lives, it is industry. They, until the end, were learning and growing, as the Adams and Jefferson letters exchange show. It's the youthful habits of deep reading that led them until the end to feel like they were not using their gifts unless they used each hour mindfully and didn't waste time. Washington loved the letter from Seneca to Lucilius on time. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be. The famous line quoted by Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream comes from Seneca, and it's the need to use each moment as if it rounded out our entire existence, recognizing that time is all that we have. We must not squander the gift. And the schedules that all of them made, not just Jefferson's reading schedule, Hamilton made up a daily schedule for his son, Philip. Washington was obsessed with clocks and would always scrupulously eat and exercise at the same time of day. And Washington embodies the virtues of self-mastery, of temper, greater than any of the other Americans. He had a fierce temper, which he may have gotten from his mom. Ram Chernow speculates that his mom was hypercritical and always nagging him, and he just exploded in anger against that. And partly in response to that and his youthful reading in the classics, he developed this granite imperturbability and resolved never to be seen out of temper in public. There were only a few occasions where he ever was. And his greatest moments are of self-mastery, like the moment at the when the soldiers are rebelling at Newburgh, and it looks like because they're not being paid, they may rebel. And he, Washington, theatrically mounts a stage called the Temple of Virtue, which has been specially constructed for the occasion. And he's always read to the soldiers from his favorite play, Cato, classically inspired, written by Joseph Addison, which exhorts the virtues of the mild consolations of philosophy embodied in tranquility of soul. And Washington addresses the troops, and he takes out his speech to read, and famously, you've heard the story, he has to put on his reading glasses because he can't read the paper, and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I find myself growing almost blind." And the soldiers have never seen him confess weakness before, and they weep. And he's so composed and mastered. And then he exhorts them to achieve a self-mastery over their passions. He says, wait, and Congress will make you whole. And they do, and Congress does. And it's that moment of self-possession that is so ennobling. That leads me to introduce the one important last big topic before I ask for your questions. And that is the connection the founders saw between personal self-government and political self-government. What's the connection between personal happiness and public happiness? Why did Washington, in his farewell address, insist that without virtue, the republic would fall and that citizens would never achieve public happiness? He meant by that unless we as citizens can master our most intemperate emotions, our anger, our jealousy, our desire to own the libs or own the conservatives, we'll degenerate into factions. And if we degenerate into factions, we'll be more guided by our own egoistic interests or our desire to identify with one political side rather than another. And then we'll be subject to demagogues. And we may fall prey, as Greece and Rome did, to flattering Caesars who will come and offer the people cheap luxuries in exchange for surrendering liberty. And Hamilton has this amazing letter to Washington where he fears that because of the tumult of democracy and the mob, a authoritarian demagogue will come in, and he says, he who is bold in temper and reckless in background, who is willing to flatter the people and subvert liberty, will mount the hobby and seek the whirlwind. And then Jefferson is also afraid of demagogues. And I found this incredible letter where he's writing to Madison about what his reaction to the Constitution is. He said, I've got two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights. And second, because the president's eligible to run for re-election, a future demagogic president might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who voted for him, and refuse to leave office and install himself as a dictator. It's extraordinary, and it's because they're so afraid of demagogues. From opposite ends, Hamilton fears the Caesar who will win an election and become a dictator by flattering the people, and Jefferson fears one who'll lose. Jefferson's solution is a one-year term limit for presidents, so they can't run for re-election. Hamilton's solution is a life term for the president. Maybe, Goldilocks would favor something in between, but the fear of that democracy will end in demagogues is the main concern the founders have. They construct the entire Constitution to avoid demagogues, to slow down deliberation, to avoid the mob. And reread through this lens, the Federalist Papers, Madison and Hamilton's defense of the Constitution, is a manual for achieving public happiness by self-mastery. And Madison says a faction is any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the common good. In all large assemblies of any character composed, says Madison, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. Athens is studying faculty psychology at Princeton, and he says that we should achieve the same balance in the constitution of the state that we seek in the constitution of our own souls. And just as the individual has to use our powers of reason to balance our emotions and desires, so the state, by balancing the executive against the Senate and the House with different faculties located in each of those bodies, and both vertically checked by the states, we can slow down deliberation, be ruled by reason rather than passion, and avoid demagogues. It all turns on public opinion. And Madison is optimistic about a new media technology that he thinks may be used to refine and educate public opinion so that the people as a whole can find the same virtuous self-mastery that they're supposed to achieve in their own faculties. And the technology is the broadside press. And he thinks that when a new class of journalists called the literati publish complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers in the newspapers, citizens will read them, they'll deliberate with each other in coffee houses, they'll talk to their representatives, they won't communicate directly with the president because you're never allowed to have direct communication with leaders. That could lead to demagogues. But by reading these complicated arguments and thoughtfully discussing them, reason will slowly diffuse across the land. Well, there was a gasp there, and obviously our current world of whatever it's called, X and Instagram and enraged to engage and social media and polarization is the opposite of the cool Republic of Reason that Madison and Hamilton and Washington hoped for. And a world where citizens are virtuously mastering their emotions through deep reading and deliberation. What more do you can, kind of these grim, mordant laughs that you give, it's a very serious state of affairs that we're in. And our politics are in a very challenging state. And we cannot know what fate or fortune has in store because nations can fall and wars can end and begin and empires explode and democracies falter with a single chance happening or a few votes or a bullet in a war that started World War I. And, these things can turn on vagaries. However, if there is a message of hope in this project, and there is one, and that's the one I want to end on, it's that we can't affect the actions of others or the thoughts of others, but we have the radically self-empowering ability to improve ourselves through deep reading. It's so inspiring that the founders, until they were old, were reading and learning and growing and exchanging tips about their books. And it just blows my mind that I was able to write this entire book and engage in this whole unusual reading project lying on my couch. Because all of these glorious books are online and they're basically free. The Delphi editions, you can get the complete works of Cicero, Aurelius, everyone on Jefferson's reading list for $1.99, or you just go to Google Books and you can actually read the actual editions that the founders read with John Adams's notes on Joseph Priestley's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita in the margins. It's just all waiting there. And when I was a kid, I went with my mom. This is the payoff of this moment of emotion is this. I went to the Library of Congress in Washington. And when you go to DC next, I still think the most beautiful building in DC is the Thomas Jefferson building in the Library of Congress. And I was just so filled with wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were in the Library of Congress. How marvelous that they could all be in one place. But now they're just on our iPhones. It's even more wondrous. It's just a glorious, wonderful gift of technology to the cultivation of the human mind. They're just waiting for us to read. All we need is the self-discipline to read them. And the truth is that this COVID reading project was unusual for me. I've had this great education, but I think I'd fallen out of the habit of deep reading for topics that weren't instrumentally related to the next piece or next thing I was going to do. And it was just the weird coincidences that I told you about that led me to develop this habit of every morning actually reading books. And it just changed my life. It's just so empowering. And it takes a resolution to do it. And I'm keeping it up, and I'm now writing another book. I'm still reading. But basically, the simple rule that I have for myself is I wake up and I pull out my phone, and I read on a Kindle or on a phone, so I read on the screen, but I'm not allowed to browse, and I can't check email, and I can't do anything with this screen except actually read a book. And I can't stop reading it until I've really read for, whatever I've set myself to, an hour or two. And it just changes your life. It's so exciting because you learn something new every day. It's almost like a lesson I'd forgotten, because we read a lot as kids, and I certainly did, but you read for school and so forth. And suddenly, just to make the time to read books is so empowering. So that's what I want to lead you with. Think of how these glorious freedom fighters and founders, some privileged, some not, empowered themselves by reading. And think of Phyllis Wheatley fighting for an education. Think of Frederick Douglass on the streets of Baltimore when his master wickedly said that his mistress wasn't allowed to teach him how to read. He felt like it was an even more crushing blow than slavery itself. They were trying to shackle his mind. So he goes to the streets of Baltimore and he pays for reading lessons with bread. He gives the boys who are his age, bread to teach him how to read. And then, this chokes me up because I was just in New Haven with David Blight, the great Frederick Douglass biographer, and he brought out a first edition of The Columbian Orator, which was the book that changed Frederick Douglass's life. And The Columbian Orator, which Douglass bought for bread on the streets of Baltimore, is a compilation of all of the great wisdom of Cicero and Seneca, the moral philosophers, as well as Franklin. And these, just a few simple, inspiring excerpts, convinced Douglass to fight slavery, become the greatest freedom fighter of his age, because of the radically empowering gift of reading. And his crusade at the end of his life was for self-reliance, which he defined as self-mastery, which he said was the definition of the pursuit of happiness. He was taking up the classical wisdom and making it his own. So, and he had to fight to learn how to read. He had to fight for books. Lincoln had to borrow books, and when he ruined a book, he had to pull corn to pay for the book. People had to fight for their education. in the old days. All we need to do is just pull out our phones and constrain ourselves for a second to take the time to actually read. And we can do it, and I highly recommend it because it's the most transformative thing I've ever done. And in the process of changing my life, it has also changed my understanding of the pursuit of happiness. Thank you so much. In the back, I think, right behind you, there's a gentleman who, if you just turn around. Oh, sorry, for the mic. Yeah, great, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much.
Then take those principles and put them actually into some form of policies and actions. And the second question that I have is there been anybody since Lincoln that actually has done the same reading that you've done, a presidential candidate or presidential person who's actually tried to apply those principles either in their own personal deeds or in policies?
That is so interesting that Lincoln may have been inspired by Pythagoras. I didn't come across that, but you've inspired me to look. Of course, he's totally self-taught. He gets it from the McGuffey Reader and Murphy's English Reader, which are like the Columbian Orator, compilations of the wisdom. So he might well have encountered Pythagoras in those readers, because Pythagoras' golden verses, there's 76 golden verses, are basically the most accessible of the classical self-help literature. And Lincoln was all about self-help. He took the phrase, he was called a self-made man. The phrase came from Henry Clay, who was Lincoln's mentor, and used it to introduce the American system. So Lincoln might well have been inspired by Pythagoras, and of course he was the great autodidact among presidents. Presidents since then, I don't know. One thing that has really given me hope as I do primary source research in American history is how high the level of debate is. So my next book is how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson have framed all of our political and constitutional battles since then, between national power versus states' rights, strict construction versus liberal construction of the Constitution, democracy versus checks on democracy have been played out in our political parties and our politics since then. So I'm reading primary sources, and for example, the Webster-Hayne debates over Congress's power to ban slavery as well as nullification, they're quoting Banquo's Ghost and Shakespeare and John Milton, but in not unaffected, but just because this is what they read. They were just well educated. And it's so inspiring. It's just so, it's conducted at such a high level. And what I found is that Andrew Jackson was a reader as well. And even though he was, denigrated as a demagogue and self-taught, he also, through his deep reading, he wrote much of the veto message on the bank and was equally a reader. And then I'm just going to keep going up as I take the story up, but I know from writing about William Howard Taft that he was a great reader and applied the lessons of his reading in the classics and the founding to view the presidency itself as something that had to resist populist passions and demagogues. And I do know this. I mean, of course, I'm a great admirer of FDR, and he certainly was a wonderful reader, and he loved reading history and quoted deeply from it and quoted from the Greeks. And at the Harvard commencement, he's quoted the phrase, "The things we are to be past hope and fear, so has it passed here." And he had a deep sense of the connections between the ancients and the moderns and channel them as well. So, and to tell you the truth, I don't know, we have to look, but think of our recent presidents, just to take the most recent ones. Clinton was voracious. George W. Bush was a deep reader, as is his wife, Laura, and Obama is a deep reader. So I think with the most recent exception, and this is actually an important point. I'm at the National Constitution Center, and I'm not allowed to have any partisan opinions at all. It's unconstitutional for me to have any. So of course I have no opinions about what should happen in the election. But Donald Trump is not a reader. I mean that as that's like a serious cause for concern that he's not a reader. And I think our previous presidents, the recent ones, have been. Yes, sir. No, I was not. I was not.
Remark imply that the President of the United States is a reader?
No, I wasn't. I said that the previous presidents were. I don't know about Biden's reading habits. He was the chair of the National Constitution Center, and he is definitely deeply interested in history, but I don't know how deep his reading habits are. I hope he reads deeply. Yes, sir.
Is there any extensive discussions among the founding fathers as to how the phrase pursuit of happiness would be interpreted in future generations? Assuming for the moment that they didn't anticipate that someday they would be a Jeffrey Rosen to tell us.
Hardly so. I mean, the main thing to say is this was not some secret or obscure phrase. I did word searches of all the documents that Jefferson relied on, and it's everywhere. You can't find it enough. The Christian sources, the reasonable Christianity people like Willitson and Tillotson use the phrase. The Whig writers like Cato's Letters, the Civic Republicans, Blackstone's commentaries, as well as novelists like Lawrence Sterne, plus the ancients, all use the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. They all use it in the same way. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which is considered authoritative for its time, has two definitions of happiness. One is the Old English word hap, which means chance or fortune, and the second is contraction of rational desires. And his citation is to John Locke, book 52 of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which uses the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. So, all of them thought, no, I don't think they were denying the colloquial sense that some people might pursue happiness by pursuing pleasure, by having some good wine or food or sex or whatever. But they just thought that wasn't our long and substantial happiness, that to achieve long-term well-being, we had to subdue our immediate desires to achieve that long-term happiness. How would they think we would? How could they have expected? How could anyone expect that happiness, how they could have expected. How could they have expected that the meaning of happiness would be transformed from their meaning to its opposite? They might have. There's a fable by Mandeville called The Fable of the Bees that a physiocrat had embraced to satirize the mistaken understanding of happiness. And the fable of the bees is they all seek immediate gratification and they thrive in their hive by selfish behavior. And that's considered so heretic that, how could you even suggest such a thing? But they knew that, look, these are the opposite of saints, and they certainly weren't going around boasting about that they were holier than thou. It's very hard to overcome your desires, and they were, as hedonistic and fallible and engaged in all the excesses as much as anyone else. But it's the idea that pop culture would come to abandon the old definition and embrace the new. They couldn't have known there was no such pop culture. I don't have a confident or good explanation for why the meaning was transformed in the 50s. There have been some different explanations. David Brooks suggests that the substitution of personality for character by Freud meant that we lost the sense that the cultivation of character is more important than the indulging of our autonomous personalities. George Will blames the Romantic movement of the 19th century and Wordsworth and Goethe or whatever, and the idea that self-expression and autonomy is more important than self-mastery. James Davidson Hunter, I think, in his book The Death of Character, blames the post-structuralists and the abandonment of our commitment to individualism and the liberal idea and the effort to attribute our behavior and our fate to the groups and identities that we're born into and not to our individual efforts. No doubt all of these are factors. But I guess just descriptively all I can say, and I'd love your thoughts, or if you do some reading and come up with a better explanation, I'd love to hear them. Once pop culture began to ratify the new understanding, here's one thought actually, that was the part of consumer culture. Once we moved from the idea of the citizen to that of the consumer, then the consumer culture had to gratify our immediate desires. And Max Weber does have a piece on capitalism where he talks about how it was consistent with the Puritan work ethic, and because self-mastery was rewarded in the market. And Daniel Bell in the 70s had a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where he said that capitalism creates this relentless market for consumers, which works against the very self-mastery and delayed gratification on which capitalism relies. And it's possible, I just heard a great scholar at UVA say, the internet's wildly expanded that, and since the algorithms and the whole marketplace feed our immediate desires by sending us down these loops and feedback mechanisms, then it's very hard to resist your immediate impulses. So that would be one way in which the 60s kind of exaltation of autonomy and freedom and free love and all that, exacerbated by this new technology of immediate gratification, is turning us into self-gratifying consumers rather than self-mastering citizens. That's it. Yeah.
Isn't it true that John Adams never had a slave?
That's right. He did. His family did have in their home. Judah was a servant, and I forgot whether she was enslaved while she was. No, she was a free African American. So I guess that's right. Benjamin Franklin did have an enslaved person in his household who was later freed. He initially was ambivalent about slavery. He came to be a strong abolitionist later in life. George Wythe, Jefferson's favorite law professor, really lived his principles, freed all of his enslaved population, and became a fierce abolitionist. Washington did free his enslaved population on his wife Martha's death and provided for their education. Better than Jefferson, not as good as George Wythe. So there was a range among the founders. Yes, in the back.
Did most of the people that you've referred to read the classics in the original languages, and did you?
I did not. Absolutely not. Not at all. My 2 years of Latin at Dalton were totally gone, and I had no ability to read Latin. Jefferson did. He said his father gave him two things: a large estate and a classical education, and he valued the classical education more than any gift his father gave him. And Adams was a classicist and read in the original, and Quincy, of course, because he taught it. But Washington didn't read in the original. Franklin didn't, and Madison did. He read Hebrew too. It's an interesting question. So a bunch of them did, but not all. And those who didn't were just as inspired as those who did. In the very back, right behind you. Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned algorithms in passing, and I wondered, within the spectrum of your narrative of learning and its influence on our lives, where you would put artificial intelligence, and where you think artificial intelligence might and the directions you think artificial intelligence might take us.
I mean, it's such a profound question. I'm just beginning to learn about the transformative effects of this technology and begin to get my head around the right questions to ask. But one challenge that AI is posing is to the ideal of reason itself. The entire Enlightenment project and the entire constitutional projects turns on the proposition that society can be governed by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And with AI, on the very simplest level, it's the machines create their information without reason. As a result, on the most basic level, much of it is made up. Hallucinating AI and deep fakes and just the difficulty of distinguishing between truth and fiction will become increasingly challenging in an age of AI. And the moral responsibility to ascribe to machines that can't reason is creating deep challenges in the law. The question of AI libel, what happens if, as is fairly frequent, I mean, and you've got to understand, there's a decent chance that what the answers at this point in the technology are literally just made up and hallucinated. And people have been libeled, accused of just stuff they didn't do all the time. Who's responsible? The programmers, the machine, the nobody. You know, ascribing responsibility is difficult, but it's and much more. I'm sure that I can barely imagine now, because we're just beginning to understand its implications. But how profound a challenge it will be, a world where machines are producing information without reason. One more, just if I may, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I admire your intellectual pursuits during COVID. I wonder what he was like during that period of time.
A barrel of laughs.
But, you know, you read about these giants that lived 200 years ago and Cicero 2,000 years ago, and you're a teacher, and I wonder what lessons you learned about following the pursuit of happiness to your students and the leaders of tomorrow. And in addition, the politicians today, I would say that most of them lack virtue, character, and don't indulge in finding out about the pursuit of happiness. So how do you make what you learn to be relevant to your students and also relevant to the politicians and the leaders today?
Well, I'm sharing with the students, you know, versions of the lessons I've been sharing with you, because I'm so eager to share them in class. I just teach one constitutional law class a year, and this term we tried an unusual method that I'm calling slow con law, where we read Supreme Court decisions out loud in class, both the majority opinions and the dissents. And it's because I've been so convinced of the radically empowering nature of reading primary text. It takes time. We get through a lot less material than we usually did, but just there's something, you learn something very powerful just reading it out loud, and we'll stop and discuss things. You get the vibe, if I may, of both the majority and the dissent, which is important, about whether it's true and convincing, and also details that you'd missed before. But the most important thing I'm trying to share is the importance, the urgent importance of listening to both sides before you make up your own mind. That open-mindedness to deliberation, the recognition that there are decent arguments on both sides, the willingness to be convinced, to be guided by reason rather than passion, is all the stuff I got from this project, and I'm trying to convey it in that way. As to the politicians, well, all they have to do is read the book. Thank you for a wonderful evening.